What's up, fam? It is Jay Williams here on the Hale Fitness podcast. I am here with Coach Katie.
Hi.
And Chelsea Worrell.
Hello.
So, Chelsea, we invited on the show today to talk a little bit about eating disorders because she's an expert. Tell us what you do, Chelsea.
So I'm a current clinical psychology doctorate student, and part of my practicum, I'm working with adolescents with eating disorders in a residential facility.
Amazing, amazing. So we talked about this actually just the other day.
Yeah.
About like we kind of touched on some of the experiences around eating disorders and how people kind of process through and think about food. And I know this is something that a lot of people struggle with, so I thought we would just pick the brain of an expert today. So let's just get started. So tell us a little bit about kind of your experience working with people with eating disorders. Like what causes this stuff? How do you kind of assess whether you have an eating disorder? And then like what do people do to sort of get help for it?
Yeah, so eating disorders tend to be kind of comorbid with other things, whether it's depression, anxiety, other types of disorders. It can either be the front concern or kind of tagged on to other concerns. So anxiety can lead to a lot of eating disorders, and it could be anxiety about like one's personal perspective of their body, what others are thinking, a sense of body dysmorphia. Depression can kind of lead into eating disorders because with depression, your kind of those eating cues, those hunger cues disappear.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we see if it's pervasive throughout the life, or throughout one's daily life, not just single situations. With the kids that we've worked with, we see that COVID was a big onset of that. A lot of isolation, shift in social life and perspective, a lot of seeing people on camera. So some of the clients that we work with, it was more of they saw an influx in their weight and a sense of panic, dysmorphia kind of set in, and then what can they do at that point? And with adolescents, it's depending on the age, like what's in their control. They're usually not the ones going out and buying stuff, and so it's how can they kind of find ways to, don't want to say like get away with it, but like so restricting what they're eating, or hiding food, or finding reasons to miss meals or whatnot, or ultimately purging. How can they, in a way, show on the front that things are all good, but behind the scenes there's something else going on.
So you're mostly working with adolescents between what are the ages?
The youngest is 11 through 17.
Whew. Got it. Okay. So this is like. These kids, this is like, for a lot of them, the first sort of time they've had to deal with eating disorders, or is this like...
It depends. Some, they've been in and out of treatment for a couple years. Some, it's their first exposure to treatment. As a residential facility, we're kind of the second step down.
Right.
Hospitalization's kind of the top, residential, and then you have like partial hospitalizations or outpatient type things, intensive outpatient.
Right.
So for some of them, it is their first experience, and it could be coming from a general care physician that, kind of waving the red flag, something's going on. And it can be a big shock for them. They're away from family, they're in this new environment, but sometimes that controlled environment's a little better than what is at home. And so seeing the positive patterns in scheduling can help them have a better foot as they leave.
Right.
But it's a long process, and we don't expect, miracles in the month to 3 months that, clients stay with us, that they're going to be fully recovered.
Right. So it's usually like a doctor or some sort of counselor that's raising a red flag. Is it parents sometimes as well?
It can be parents,
yeah.
Doctors, sometimes even like social workers can do it, depending on who's getting the contact with the child. If they're seeing there's a concern, the easiest way is when it is doctors, because it's looking at some of those medical tests, like how's the heart doing?
Yeah.
How are the organs kind of functioning? Because a lot of times those are the unseen things that are really being impacted.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because like you said, kind of eating disorders come from a lot of sort of other factors. There's anxiety, depression, that kind of thing. Like, But when it comes down to it, you're focusing on one thing, which is like eating or not eating. But there's obviously much bigger issues at play, right? So how do you sort of connect those things, you know, and how, like, are you counseling them basically on their source of depression, anxiety, or?
I would say you can't help one without helping the other. So you're kind of tackling everything all together.
Yeah.
Because if, you know, the depression's the source and you're not acknowledging kind of the aftermath of it or what's, you know, helping it or what's being caused by the depression.
Yeah.
Only pieces are going to maybe get fixed and the puzzle's still not going to be complete. So by covering it all together and helping make the connections, you know, they might not realize that A is causing B, which is causing C. So kind of being able to connect those dots makes the patient just even more aware of what's going on.
Yeah. I just find this really fascinating because, I mean, eating disorders, like on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, 1 being like, I have no issues with, you know, nutrition, to 10 being like full on eating disorder, your life is in danger, right? I mean, we work with people probably more on the spectrum of like 4 or 5 here at the gym. You're working with people closer to like, you know, 9, 10.
Right.
But a lot of the underlying issues are really similar. So we're talking about like, hey, you should eat more vegetables, or, you know, you should not worry so much about, you know, having a piece of cake here and there. But really it comes down to like, what are the habits that are leading, or what are the lifestyle factors that are leading into you making these choices or making these other choices? So we end up talking about like life more than food.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm just like, what I'm really curious about is like, how do you start this conversation? Like somebody comes in and they're just like anorexic or something like that. They're like not eating. How do you start a conversation like this?
That's a great question. I think it's really what is their perspective, you know, really understanding if there's a distortion of like, oh, I'm fine, but other things are showing that you're not fine.
Yeah.
I think that helps create a clear picture, and then breaking it down of like what else is going on. So I'd mentioned, you know, there's other things like depression, anxiety, but it also could be cultural. It could be what's happening in the home. It's also our society and social media, and with, you know, adolescents, social media plays such a big role. So kind of seeing where these pieces are coming from, and one's perspective of like, I'm fine, I'm doing great, but I can barely stand up without getting dizzy. Okay, so that's kind of where let's get you to a point where you're somewhat stable. And then kind of picking away, learning their bigger story, then helps you kind of pull away of like, this is what may be contributing, this might be what's contributing. Because it's not just one or two things. There's so much that's going around it. And to me, that's more of like that holistic perspective. You're looking at, you know, them growing up, what their life's like right now, what their goals are, because all that influences what they're doing right now.
Right. So we're really kind of highlighting like there's something going on here.
Yeah, it almost sounds like it's almost like a matter of there being all these different layers, right? Of like, and I remember, because I was anorexic, I spent time in the hospital, I spent time in these inpatient programs, and I remember when I was diagnosed, I had no idea I had an eating disorder. Like, that wasn't even language that I knew anything about, and it was a doctor's intervention, right, that sent me to the hospital. But like, what's interesting is that we're talking about like these different layers, and I know like what happens oftentimes when we get embedded into that 10, like that eating disorder 10, is that there's so much anxiety existing around food and the process of eating and everything around there that it's like you can't even begin to address the underlying anxiety until you get out of that top layer. And what's so interesting about it is that it plays out even with people who aren't at a 10, because that's what you're talking about. Like we see it all the time here of like, okay, we're going to address this thing that you see as an issue of your weight, your food, whatever. And it's like, because that is the thing your mind is fixated on right now. That's what you're having anxiety about right now. Let's address that piece of it. And then once we get through that piece, oftentimes what becomes illuminated is, oh, guess what? Now that my nutrition is different, now that I'm fitter, I thought all these things in my life were going to be roses, but actually that didn't fix everything, right?
Yes.
So now I'm understanding that part of like my anxiety is actually more deep rooted than that. And I actually have more stuff that I got to keep looking at if I actually really want to change quality of life for better. I thought it was all this superficial surface layer stuff, but actually that was just to guys.
Yeah. And I love that you bring up that fixation because it's so prevalent in everyone and the fixation is so different. You know, it can be from specific foods to types of food to textures of food or what the food's causing, fixations on oneself. What is it doing to me? What is it doing to others' perspectives of me? And that's truly like once you get past that or start, you know, chipping away at it, it opens that door, peels back another layer to work on something else.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really curious, like, so you said you work with people 1 to 3 months, or how does that?
So the minimum stay is usually about 4 weeks
Okay.
per client, and it depends on, you know, our regular concerns of insurance cover,
Yeah.
but also if we can get them a little longer, they just might need more time. It
Yeah.
takes, I would say, from what I've seen the last couple of months, anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to really for a client to realize there's a problem.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes it's like, oh, I'm just going to do what you say and I'm going to get out of here.
Yeah.
And they need that time in this
Right.
environment to be like, oh, snap, there is a problem. And
Oh, snap.
I'm having to come face to face with it. And that's
Yeah.
when we see a lot of like, it's kind of like a hill, like all of a sudden the depression, the anxiety come up because they're accepting it.
Yeah.
But it just opens this door of like, okay, I guess I need to do the work. What I was doing was going through the motions.
Yeah.
So that timeline varies for everyone. And then also just the severity of the client when they come in. You know,
Yeah.
how much weight do they need to restore? How much support do they need? How much do we need to work with, you know, setting them and their family up for success once they leave us?
So that was my question, really. So you work with people for some amount of time, 1 month to longer, and you're measuring success by, it sounds like one of the keys is like for them to recognize they have a problem. Are there other measures that you use for success in counseling people here?
So we have a huge treatment team. You're looking at psychiatrists, dietitians, nurse practitioners, the psychologists, therapists, and just our regular staff. And so everyone's kind of looking at different things. You know, what can we work on in a therapeutic setting, diet-wise? We do use the BMI, which, you know, a bit controversial in some realms, but it helps us get a gauge of like, where should this client be in terms of their age and their height? Just finding a balanced ground of like, okay, this is a healthy place for them to be when they leave us.
Yeah. Okay. So there are actually some numbers that you're trying to hit. Yeah. Okay.
So that's mainly our dietitian. Our psychiatrist is looking like, what are some underlying things? Potentially, is medication an option? Would that benefit this client? Nurses just, you know, taking vitals every day, checking in. And with those underlying things, like we are checking for anything around self-harm, suicidal ideations, because it's a whirlwind of a process for them. They're going through so much, so we're trying to hit all the bases.
Yeah.
And it's more of like one person can't do this, so how strong can we make our team to support them?
How many, like, give me a sense of how big the sort of clinic or center is. How many people do you work with?
So our house holds about 6 clients.
Yep.
It's a regular like house you find in a neighborhood. Large house, there's 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms.
Right. And you'll see what, 6 to 12 folks in a month, or like?
I would say closer to probably like 8. 8 different people you'd see in a month, because people are, I would say it's very rare for someone just to be there for the 4 weeks.
Right.
They're averaging more on that like 6 to 8 weeks. So it's a bit slow of a turnaround, and it all depends when people are coming in and leaving. Like, what is that pace? So like recently, I think we had a turnover of 4 clients left, 4 new clients came in. So that's a big turnover to where it's usually like 1 or 2 here and there.
Is this like a public benefit or a private business?
It's a private clinic. It's kind of connected to Fremont Hospital in a way, kind of attached to the hospital in a way. They send a lot of patients to us, but we also get patients from all over the Bay.
Right. Okay. So it's a private business, for profit. So where I'm going with this is just like, at the end of each month or each quarter, it's like, how do we determine success? And it's just funny, like, what are the messages that you're sending out to all the people that are referring? It's like, hey, people that come here, get X, Y, Z results. Mm-hmm. And so this is where kind of the numbers come in.
It does, and it's definitely a double-edged sword because it is for profit, but at the same time, you're looking at like, what's the best thing for these clients?
Yeah.
We don't want to just, let's see how many clients we can get in and out in a month. It's like you play that balance of like, we want to set you up for success. And when they leave us, they're not just going home to nothing. Mm-hmm. They're just stepping down to a lower level of support. So often a partial hospitalization or intensive
that was my next question.
Outpatient care. So we're just getting them to that next step and not necessarily just, here you go, you're off on your own.
Yeah.
So if we can get to them to a point to where they can be supported better by the next step, that's also kind of what we're looking at as well. But it's not just weight, it's where are they mentally, what kind of supports. And sometimes we'll add on to like, you're going to a lower care of ED support, but can we add in some additional mental health in that? And so we look at all those things as well. And even if it's like food scarcity is a concern for them, how can we support the family in that? Because that can, though not a direct cause, it can support some of those bad habits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I kind of want to shift to like what happens when folks sort of leave this, right? So this is like acute, like there's a huge problem here, potentially life-threatening. We need to get into the clinic and work with you, right? And then as you start to kind of progress, then what happens next? So this is kind of where you've been through some of this yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So were you in a clinic like this when you...
Yeah, I spent time when I was first diagnosed. I was in high school, so it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, I spent time in a
so
hospital.
The age of the folks you work with.
Basically.
Yeah.
I was a high schooler. Yeah, so... I was hospitalized and then went from hospitalization back home and then stayed in what they called intensive outpatient. So it's like you had regular sessions with a therapist and with a dietitian and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Supported that way for a long time. And then
How long?
Probably a couple of years. Yeah, basically the remainder of the time that I was living at home. And it went on and off because I also had numbers that I was supposed to hit. Right? I had to be above 95 pounds. Like I remember 95 was my number, and anything below that, it was like my mom was like, I'm bringing you to the doctor.
Right.
It's funny because we were talking about earlier this week doing podcasts, and we were like, we need to find a way to make podcasts funnier. And I'm like, great, let's talk about eating disorders. Like,
hilarious.
That's a great way to make podcasts funnier. But I was actually thinking about it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, and it's fun. I mean, it's not fun. Like, it is a serious thing, but some of the things, now that I can actually say from the other side being fully recovered, like, holy crap, some of the stuff that you do is insane. Like, when you are so possessed and so obsessed with this thing, it's like, I remember, because 95 was my number, and I remember, like, continuing to restrict while I was at home and continue to try to starve myself, because, of course, like, I'm looking at myself and I'm like, oh, I got fat here, and I'm terrified of that. I would, like, before my weigh-in, drink a ton of water. I would take I had a change purse, and I would fill it with all of the change.
Oh my God.
I would literally strap it to my leg.
Wow.
And then I remember trying to tiptoe up the stairs because our scale was upstairs. And I didn't want my mom to hear like the ringing of the change that was strapped to my leg. And it's just like, that is insane. But that is just like, I think like that's one of the things like illustrates like when you're in the depths of this disease, you truly don't have a lot of control. And I think like this is one of the popular misconceptions about eating disorders is that like just eat more food. Like I don't see the problem, right? And it's like, but you are it's just like any other.
You have this habit of
disease.
not doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an addiction. Like it's not just a habit; it is an addiction.
Yeah, and people like that misconception. People think it's a choice, and it's not.
Yeah.
Like, once you're so
entrenched
deep into it, it's like, I can't just choose to go against these thoughts and these feelings that I'm having.
Totally.
It just takes everything in me to contradict what I've been telling myself is good, is benefiting me.
Totally. Yeah, and it's reinforced, right? By like people commenting on, oh, you look so thin. Like there's an attention aspect of it too that's like super appealing.
Yeah.
But I don't even remember your original question. What happens in the aftermath, or how long is treatment or whatnot? Yeah. Right. Anyway, so like 95 was my number. I was able to stay above it, or trick myself to stay above it or whatnot. And like I think the difficult thing for me was that and probably like some of the patients that you had, like the therapy for me didn't really work. The talk therapy for me didn't really work. Like seeing the dietitian was probably the best thing, because it was here's what you must eat. And so I was like, all right, a lot of kids who like have disordered eating, and even like I noticed it among folks who I work with here who like have histories, I can almost pick them out before I even ask the question, because they typically tend to be people who are like very numbers oriented, very analytical, which is part of that like biological component, right? Of like some of us are predisposed a little bit more genetically. Even though none of us are destined to have an eating disorder, there is a genetic component. But so like that kind of therapy never really worked for me. And it wasn't until, 12 years out of the intense, hospitalization that I would say I was even close to recovery. Actually, it's why I do what I do now, because I'm like, it shouldn't take 12 years.
So I actually want to dig into something that you said, because like when we talked about like doing this,
right?
Like first thing in my head is just like, okay, maybe I'm not the best person to host this thing, because I think about stuff a little bit differently.
Totally.
I want to dig into it's not a choice, right?
Yeah.
Because I think this is like on one of your misconceptions that you wrote, is like that it is like most people think this is a choice, right? So I want to ask, like, as you start to kind of recover from this, right? Now obviously you have these habits about like, I'm not eating, or I'm like obsessed with the scale, or whatever it is, right? Or I eat and, binge and purge, whatever. So as you start to kind of recover, at a certain point, you are making some different choices.
Yeah.
It's just not as simple as eat or not eat. It's there's a lot more to it. Would you say that's true or no?
Yeah, and I would say it's like creating those new habits and kind of bringing that support of, why am I doing this? Why am I making this choice? Even though everything in my being is saying no.
Yeah.
So putting kind of that power and incentive behind, like, I'm doing this to better me, to better my relationships, and ultimately to get me for my clients, to get me out of here, to get me to that next step, closer to my goal. And it's something we tell them every day, like, every day is not going to be perfect. We don't expect you to like be 100% every day. You're going to have those days where it is completely draining just to get through the day, to do what's being asked of you, and we understand that.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of, as we start new things and we're working through our things, nothing's perfect. And so kind of being upfront with them that like, we're not expecting perfection. You're going to have those ups and downs, and that's okay, because we all have those. Kind of gives that leeway of like, okay, so by starting slowly of like, I'm getting through my meals and my snacks, great. Sometimes you're substituting for a supplement, but if we can get the supplement down, that's great. Yeah. And so making those small little goals, and they're seeing the progress.
So it's sort of like we talked about in the different podcasts. It's like, the elephant and the rider. Yeah. It's just like the elephant is going to go in a different in a direction, and the rider can influence the elephant, but it can't actually make it turn right. Yeah. Yes. It can slowly kind of get it in an arc, but you are at some point making choices.
Yeah. I feel like one of the best analogies I've heard is like it's like almost a detox period. So like if you think about an alcoholic, if they abstain from alcohol for long enough, they can regain some functionality where they're not obsessing over it. It's not controlling every thought of every day.
Yeah.
The challenge with eating disorders is that you can't detox from food.
Right. Yeah.
You can't just like make it not a thing.
You have to eat food.
Food.
Yeah.
And so the detox process looks different, and that's why like it looks like there's a choice, but really it's like, okay, how can we almost like detox from this relationship that you have to food?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can start to like bring some functionality back. But I love that you said like it's a connection of the why, because when I look back on my recovery, like if I were to pinpoint one thing that made the difference, it was like I was able to find another purpose. or like I had something that was compelling me beyond just the food. And I feel like sometimes what happens in treatment, and this can go for like treatment when people are like 10 out of 10, but also people when they're struggling with stuff around their bodies, is that the treatment is almost always focused on the body. It's like, okay, how do we get rid of these eating disorder behaviors, right? How do we stop doing this? How do we start doing this? And it's all related to food and fitness and movement and body. And it's like, that's great, but in the case of an eating disorder, if you take away eating disorder behaviors, you're still left with a gigantic void, right?
Yeah, which you can fill with
Which you
other
can
things,
fill
like,
with other-
like
right?
alcohol or drugs, or
Exactly. And so I always felt like in treatment, the emphasis was so much on like, let's take these behaviors away, X behaviors away, but there was no one helping me understand what to fill that hole with.
I think it's the exact same thing. My philosophy on this is if you have a bigger reason, if you have something that goes beyond what's going to happen in the next week or two, then you will make long-term decisions.
Yeah.
And I think when we're struggling with sort of mental health, which is, eating disorders, addiction, all of the different things, it's really focused on what is in front of you, what's happening right now, what's happening in the next week. And most people struggle to think beyond that.
Yeah.
And it sounds like part of what you get out of this is finding some reason to exist, or something to do, like some reason to live. is what it comes down to. Right? That is beyond like how I look in the mirror or how I feel at this very moment. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes. And it's interesting because the clients that we struggle to get that reason, we know that, okay, we might see them back, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But then we have our other clients that, they might have been in this process for a while, and they're like, here is my why. And we're like, great, we're going to take that and run with it. Because I feel like that's the hardest thing to uncover, is their why. And especially for the adolescent population, sometimes it's hard for them to just think beyond where they are right now. Around this whole, whether it's in high school, this whole social scene, like, what is our goal outside of this? And sometimes they're just so entrapped in that like bubble that it's hard for them to see. And so those goals can be like, I want to strengthen my relationship with my family. I've put them through so much. Or just with my friends, I want to just go back to the way things were. And it can be as simple as that. And if they're willing to put in that work, it's great, but it takes some people a while to really uncover what that why is.
Yeah, and once you start to do that, then you make different choices because you have a different path that you're going down. I absolutely love that. It reminds me, we did a show a few weeks back about like, is it worth it to get lean?
Right.
Because I've gotten down to the point where I'm like 8% body fat, and I remember specifically, okay, I want to hit this goal, and I'm going for this thing, and I remember the closer I got to it, the less happy I was. And like, whatever, happiness isn't everything, but I was like, why do I care so much about how I look right now? Like, it didn't matter before, and now it's like so much more important. And I think that's kind of one of the sort of general philosophies around our gym is just like, everyone, a lot of people come in here with the goal of, I want to lose weight or I want to look better. And then when they train long enough, they realize, actually, that stuff is like nice, but it's not everything. And the more you can focus on things that are beyond that, in terms of like your reason for working out or eating well, then the longer you'll be able to sustain it, because it's actually not going to make you feel better to look quote unquote better.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. And I feel similar, like, and I would never like ever shame anyone for having an aesthetic goal.
No, I think it's
like, if someone wants to lose weight, like I 100% understand the reasoning behind it. And I feel like it is my job to like, if that is the goal, like, great, I will help you do this in the like healthiest way possible. And I will continue to check in with you along the way of like, what are you getting out of this? Like, what is...
Yeah, absolutely.
What are you gaining? From this process? So that,
And I think that's part of the journey, and like you have to go through some of those experiences to realize it. Thinking back, I think working with this population, I had to do a deep dive in like, okay, there has been disordered eating from my many years in sports and what did that kind of put on me. And I think the realization towards the end of my college career was, I'm in a bigger body, but I'm getting things done. And so while others are like, well, why don't you just slim down? Well, I can, but I'm good where I'm at. And I think it's hard to come to that realization and accept it because everything around you, whether it's your teammates and you're looking at them or just the messages of like, this is what the athlete should look like.
Yeah.
So being able to accept that it was a huge challenge that I feel like I faced a lot of just my athletic career. But when I came to the realization of like, I'm doing just as good, if not better than you. So why am I going to put myself through more pain in a way to live up to your standards than just being happy with where I'm at?
Yeah. And I think it kind of comes back to what you said, Katie. It was just like people have their goals for whatever reasons they have their goals. And I think part of the reason I went for that is to see if I could do it.
Yeah.
Right. It's not, and that was valid for me at the time.
Totally.
There's a lot of other things that I want to see if I can do right now. A handstand walk, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I think you should never feel shame or, look, shame is a natural human emotion, right? But I think if you find yourself feeling shame, then that's when it's time to sort of question. It's like, why am I feeling this shame, right? And who's putting this on me, or is it just me putting it on myself? Who am I trying to look good in front of, et cetera, right? So, yeah, I think I think personally, looking at the extremes of things actually helps inform the quote unquote regular folks, right? So I think this is a super useful conversation to kind of dig into how this stuff happens.
Yeah. I'm curious about because we have a lot of people here who come, and we've talked a little bit about this, with a similar background as you. I used to be the track athlete. I used to be a swimmer. I used to this and that. And then I had a life. I got a partner. I had kids. My body has changed, and I'm trying to deal with that. Who am I now? Can I still be athletic? Is it worth it for me to try to change my body? Is it realistic to think I'm going to have my high school body again? You have been through this, and from what I understand, what you're studying too was you're really interested in the sports psychology of how does that identity shift impact the way you progress through life. So what advice would you give, or based on your own experiences of, hey, I used to be a freaking lacrosse superstar. Now I have other priorities in my life, and I'm trying to manage that. What is my new identity?
Right. And I would say my advice is, it's hard after the fact, but when you're in it, so if you know someone, what are their other identities? Coming up and realizing what are my other identities outside of lacrosse? I have academics. What are some of my other hobbies that I love and that will kind of fill that void when lacrosse kind of subsides and it's not as filling up my time. Because that is, I think, the biggest thing is when anyone really transitions out of sport where this has been your life, you're left with this huge void of I've only known life as this athlete, as this type of person, and I don't know what to do. And so by being able to kind of pick out gradually, I also do this. I also enjoy, I'm trying to, in my mind, student, so much of my time comes up as student, and what am I then doing with that, And it could be I transitioned from playing to coaching. That was how I was able to kind of keep my foot still in kind of the world of lacrosse. But being able to make that transition was hard because I was I don't know what to do. I don't know who I am. So I always say for those still kind of in that mindset, who are you also? And then for those outside of it, in terms of they've already made that transition, just recognizing all the great things that you are. That you're doing and being okay with that. And still you'll always have that small piece of, whether you are a basketball player, soccer player, lacrosse player, or whatever your activity was, it will always be there, but understanding kind of what you're walking into now and how you're kind of evolving in that. I don't know if that answers.
Totally. Yeah. That's super, I think that's super interesting because I think that is when people start asking themselves those questions of oh, my identity is changing. Who am I now? I think we've talked, we were talking about too, circling all the way back to those disordered eating habits is that when we feel things are outside of our control, And when our identity shifts, that's a big one, is like, holy crap, I'm going to latch on to something that is in my control.
Exactly.
Like a diet, like a,
Yeah. Yeah. I think I do think it's really important to have something that you feel like you can control some of the outcome, right? And I think this is one where as a former athlete coming into a place like this, is like you're doing a training that feels like what you used to do, and the outcome that you're looking for is different than what you had before. And so now it might just be like, okay, now I care about how much I can deadlift, right? And this is a different goal than what I had when I played lacrosse. And it just gives you something now you can focus on, just like you said, because if there is this void of like, this is what I used to be, and you don't like give yourself a new focus, then you'll be trying to basically be everything that you're always identified with. So, all right. I love this. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Are there any other questions or any sort of last words? Nothing? All right. Excellent. Katie, anything to add?
No, I don't think so. I think like the main thing when I think about like the people who are our population here listening to this is like, there's one of the reasons we wanted to do this show was because a lot of us have this background, and we might not be in the full throes of an eating disorder now, but we might still engage in disordered eating here and there. And so I think there's so much shame that comes up around that. Part of one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it was because it normalizes that experience.
Yeah.
And so I think like that is how, anyone who's listening to this, like if you have had an experience of disordered eating, like being willing to like communicate that, share that, I think is like super important in taking back the power from it.
Yeah.
So I would just encourage people to like be willing to open up with their friends or family, whoever they're close to, or their coach, like, and be willing to share their story because it's powerful.
Yeah. And it doesn't make you, it's not something to be ashamed of. It's just something you've been through.
Yep.
Right. It's like, you've had this thing that happened, and hey, just so you know, I've had this issue that is, or I've gone through this. So when you make a recommendation to me about this or that, that's the background.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not like I'm going to, ignore you, but just be careful.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's really powerful. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for
Chelsea.
having me.
Yeah. And if anyone has any questions or they want to know more about what you do, how could they reach out to you?
Yeah, you can reach out from email. Trying to think what email.
Could just how about this? Send us an email
Yes.
at info@halefitness.com, and we will send it along to you.
Perfect.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this episode, we've got plenty of others. Go check out this one over here.